It was supposed to be just another quiet evening, the kind of night that had become so routine in our marriage that I hardly noticed the monotony anymore. I was sprawled out on the couch, scrolling through headlines on my phone, while Jessica sat across the room flipping through a magazine. The silence between us wasn't hostile, but it wasn't warm either. It was the kind of silence that grows over years of taking each other's presence for granted. I remember glancing at the clock, 9:47 p.m. It was late, and I was debating whether to call it a night or squeeze in one more episode of some forgettable show. That's when Jessica spoke. "I'm going out," she said, her tone casual, almost dismissive. I looked up, confused. "Out? Where?" "Just a party," she replied, not even bothering to look at me as she stood and smoothed the hem of her dress. It wasn't just any dress. It was the dress, a sleek black number she hadn't worn in years, the kind that clung to her curves and turned heads wherever she went. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. Jessica wasn't the late-night party type. At least, not anymore. "A party?" I repeated, my voice tinged with disbelief. "It's almost 10 o'clock. She shrugged, finally meeting my eyes. "So? It's not a big deal, Alex." "Not a big deal? Since when did Jessica make plans without telling me? Since when did she decide to dress like that and head out at an hour when most people were winding down? Who's throwing the party?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Just some friends," she said, waving a hand dismissively. Her vagueness set off alarm bells in my head. Jessica had always been detail-oriented, to the point of over-explaining everything. The fact that she was brushing off my questions felt wrong. "Jessica," I said, sitting up straighter, "this seems out of the blue. Is everything okay?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "Everything's fine, Alex. I just want to go out for a bit. Do I need to run every plan by you?" The defensiveness in her tone was new, and it caught me off guard. "No, of course not," I said quickly. "It's just, you don't usually go out like this, especially so late." She sighed, exasperated. "I don't need your permission. I'll be back later." With that, she grabbed her purse and headed for the door. I watched her go, my stomach twisting into knots. Something about this didn't sit right with me. I sat there for a long time after the door closed, the sound of her heels clicking down the hallway echoing in my ears. The house felt eerily quiet without her, and I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. This wasn't normal. Jessica wasn't acting like herself. She hadn't even bothered to tell me whose party it was or why she suddenly felt the need to go. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she just needed a break. Maybe she was feeling restless, and this was her way of blowing off steam. But the way she brushed off my questions, the way she looked at me like I was the one being unreasonable, it didn't feel like Jessica. It felt like someone I didn't know. As the minutes turned into hours, my mind spiraled with questions I didn't want to ask. Was she meeting someone? Was this about more than just a party? I glanced at the clock again, 11:23 p.m. Jessica still wasn't home. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over her contact name. But I didn't call. Instead, I stared at the blank screen, my thoughts racing. I wanted to trust her. I wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation for all of this. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, as I sat alone in our living room, a cold realization settled over me. My marriage wasn't as solid as I thought it was. When Jessica left that night, it wasn't just her heels echoing in the hallway. It was the sound of something cracking in my chest. I told myself I was overreacting, that people go to parties all the time without explaining every detail to their spouse. But as I sat alone on the couch, staring at the door she just walked out of, the doubts crept in like uninvited guests. She didn't even tell me whose party it was. That was the first thing that stuck in my mind. Jessica was always the kind of person who thrived on details. She'd tell me about every person she spoke to, every joke she laughed at, every bite of food she enjoyed. But tonight? Nothing. No names, no context, just a party. And then there was the dress. It wasn't just a dress. It was that dress. I hadn't seen her wear it in years. It was the kind of outfit that commanded attention, the kind of dress that said, "Look at me." I used to love when she wore it. It reminded me of the woman I first fell for, confident, stunning, and full of life. But tonight, it felt different. Out of place. I tried to brush it off. Maybe she just wanted to feel good about herself. Maybe this was her way of shaking off the routine that had settled over our lives like a heavy fog. God knows we could both use a break from the monotony. But it wasn't just the dress. It was the way she looked at me before she left, the way she dismissed my questions as if they were beneath her. It was the coldness in her tone, the impatience in her eyes. It didn't feel like Jessica. It felt like someone I didn't know. By the time the clock hit midnight, I was pacing the living room, my mind racing. I glanced at my phone again, debating whether to call her. But what would I even say? Hey, just checking to see if you're, what? Safe? Alone? Not lying to me? I shook my head, feeling ridiculous. I was being paranoid. Jessica was my wife. We'd been married for 5 years. She loved me. She wouldn't. But then again, when was the last time we really talked? When was the last time she looked at me like she used to, with warmth and admiration instead of boredom or frustration? I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment things started to shift between us, but they had. Somewhere along the way, our conversations had turned into exchanges of logistics. What's for dinner? When's the mortgage due? Who's picking up the dry cleaning? The laughter we used to share had been replaced by strained silences, and the passion that once defined our relationship had dwindled to a flicker. Still, I never doubted her. Not really. Until now. The hours dragged on, each tick of the clock amplifying the unease gnawing at my gut. I tried to distract myself, TV, a book, even tidying up the kitchen. But my mind kept circling back to the same questions. Who was she with? Why hadn't she told me more? Why did it feel like she wasn't coming home? At 2:13 a.m., I finally heard the faint sound of keys jingling in the lock. I froze, my heart pounding as the door swung open. Jessica stepped inside, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She looked different. Her hair was slightly disheveled, her makeup smudged in a way that wasn't entirely accidental. Her eyes met mine briefly before darting away. "You're still up?" she asked, her tone casual, almost annoyed. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Couldn't sleep." "Long night," she said with a shrug, dropping her purse on the counter. She didn't elaborate, didn't offer any details about where she'd been or who she'd been with. "Did you have fun?" I asked, my words heavier than I intended. "Yeah," she replied, kicking off her heels. "It was fine." Fine. That word hit me harder than I expected. Fine? After leaving the house dressed like that, after being gone for hours, all she could say was that it was fine. I wanted to ask her more, to press her for answers. But something in her demeanor stopped me. She wasn't acting guilty. She was acting indifferent. And that, somehow, felt worse. She disappeared into the bathroom, leaving me standing there in the living room, the air between us thick with unspoken words. When she finally came out, she didn't say a word. She just slipped into bed and turned off the light, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As I lay there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, the doubts grew louder. This wasn't just about a party. This was about something deeper, something I didn't want to admit. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like a stranger in my own home. And for the first time, I started to wonder if Jessica was hiding something from me. The unease from that night clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. Jessica's indifference, her vague answers, the way she had walked past me as though I barely existed. It gnawed at me. Something was off. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, but the pit in my stomach told a different story. The next morning, Jessica acted as if nothing had happened. She sat at the kitchen table sipping her coffee, scrolling through her phone, the picture of calm. I tried to read her, to pick up on anything that might give me a clue, but her face was a blank slate. "Late night," I said, keeping my tone casual. She didn't look up. "Yeah, I told you it was a party." Her nonchalance was infuriating. I wanted to press her, to demand details, but I knew that approach wouldn't get me anywhere. Jessica wasn't the type to respond well to confrontation. Instead, I nodded and sipped my own coffee, pretending everything was fine. But it wasn't. Later that day, while Jessica was out running errands, I found myself pacing the living room. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. I couldn't keep ignoring the feeling that something was wrong. I sat down, my hands shaking slightly as I picked up my phone. I wasn't proud of what I was about to do, but the need for answers outweighed the guilt. I opened our shared phone account, scrolling through the call and text logs. There it was, an unfamiliar number. At first, I thought it might be nothing, just a random call or text from someone I didn't know. But as I looked closer, the pattern became clear. Dozens of calls, hundreds of texts, all to the same number. My heart pounded as I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Who was this? A friend? A coworker? Or someone else? The texts were frequent, far more than casual communication. Some of them were sent late at night, others during times when I knew Jessica was supposedly at work. I couldn't stop myself. I copied the number into my phone and dialed it, my heart thudding in my chest as I waited for it to ring. But it didn't ring. It went straight to voicemail. The voice on the recording was male, deep and confident. "Hey, this is Ryan. Leave a message." Ryan. The name felt like a punch to the gut. My mind instantly jumped to the worst-case scenario, even though I had no proof. Was this the person she'd been with last night? Was this why she'd been acting so strange? I hung up without leaving a message, my hands shaking as I set the phone down. My thoughts spiraled, each one darker than the last. I wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, but the evidence was mounting against her. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, going through the motions while my mind replayed the events of the past few days. Jessica's indifference, her late-night outing, the mysterious number. None of it added up. That night, as she sat on the couch watching TV, I found myself studying her, looking for any telltale signs of guilt. But she was calm, almost too calm. I decided to test the waters. "Hey, Jess," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Who were you texting last night?" She didn't even flinch. "What? No one important. Just curious," I said, forcing a smile. "You seemed pretty busy on your phone." She shrugged, not taking her eyes off the screen. "It was just some friends." "Why?" "Just wondering," I replied, my stomach twisting at how effortlessly she lied. Her response confirmed what I already suspected. Jessica was hiding something, and if I wanted the truth, I was going to have to find it myself. That night, while Jessica slept, I sat in the kitchen with her phone in my hand. I debated for hours whether or not to do it, but my need for answers finally won out. The messages were all there, each one a dagger to the heart. "Ryan, can't wait to see you again." "Jessica, last night was amazing." "Ryan, you looked incredible in that dress." "Jessica, I couldn't stop thinking about you today." I stopped reading, the bile rising in my throat. There it was, confirmation of everything I'd been afraid of. Jessica wasn't just hiding something. She was having an affair. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the screen, my hands shaking. Part of me wanted to wake her up, to confront her right then and there. But another part of me, the part that still couldn't fully process what I just discovered, kept me rooted to the chair. I felt a strange mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. This was my wife. The woman I'd built a life with, the person I thought I knew better than anyone. And yet here she was, betraying me in the worst way possible. By the time I finally put her phone back on the nightstand and crawled into bed, my mind was made up. I couldn't ignore this. I couldn't pretend everything was fine. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The following morning, I woke up with a heavy weight on my chest, the knowledge of Jessica's betrayal hanging over me like a dark cloud. She was still asleep, lying peacefully as if she hadn't ripped our marriage apart with her lies. I stared at her for a moment, trying to reconcile the woman I had fallen in love with years ago with the one who had so casually betrayed me. I couldn't hold it in any longer. By the time she came into the kitchen, dressed in her usual morning robe and holding a cup of coffee, I was already seated at the table, the tension thick in the air. She gave me a brief, tired smile, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. "Morning," she said, her tone light. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The words were trapped in my throat, threatening to spill out in a chaotic rush. She frowned, setting her coffee down. "Are you okay?" That was it, the opening I needed. "No, Jessica, I'm not okay." My voice was calm, but the undercurrent of anger was unmistakable. She froze, her eyes narrowing slightly. What's that supposed to mean? I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. Who's Ryan? Her reaction was instant. Her eyes widened for just a fraction of a second before she masked it with feigned confusion. Ryan? I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, I said, my voice rising. I saw the messages, Jessica. I know everything. The color drained from her face, and for a moment, she just stared at me, her coffee forgotten. You went through my phone? That's what you're upset about? I shot back, disbelief coursing through me. Not the fact that you've been sneaking around behind my back? Her face hardened, her expression shifting from shock to defiance. You had no right to invade my privacy. Privacy? I barked out a bitter laugh. We're married, Jessica. Privacy doesn't mean sneaking off to see some other guy while I'm sitting at home like an idiot. She crossed her arms, her posture defensive. It's not what you think. Really? I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Because those texts sure looked like something to me. Last night was amazing. I couldn't stop thinking about you. Do you want to explain what that means? Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might try to deny it again. But then, she let out a heavy sigh, as if the weight of the truth was too much to keep carrying. Fine, she said quietly. Yes, I've been seeing someone. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, knocking the air out of my lungs. Even though I already knew, hearing her say it out loud made it all too real. How long? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Does it matter? She shot back, her tone sharp. It matters to me, I said, my fists clenching at my sides. How long, Jessica? She hesitated, then looked away. A few months. A few months. The words echoed in my head, each syllable twisting the knife deeper. While I had been trying to keep our marriage afloat, she had been investing her time and energy into someone else. Why? I asked, my voice trembling. Why would you do this? She shrugged, her indifference cutting me like a blade. I don't know, Alex. Things haven't been good between us for a long time. Maybe I just needed something different. Something different? I repeated, my voice rising. Instead of talking to me, instead of trying to fix things, you decided to go behind my back and cheat? She rolled her eyes, her attitude infuriatingly casual. Don't act like you're perfect, Alex. Our marriage hasn't exactly been a fairy tale. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. Are you seriously trying to blame this on me? You're the one who lied. You're the one who cheated. Her expression remained impassive, as if my anger didn't faze her. Maybe if you paid more attention to me, I wouldn't have needed to find it somewhere else. That was the breaking point. The sheer audacity of her words left me speechless, my body trembling with a mix of fury and heartbreak. Don't you dare put this on me, I said, my voice low and dangerous. I gave you everything, Jessica. I tried to make this work, even when you didn't seem to care. And this is how you repay me? She didn't respond, her silence infuriating. I can't do this anymore, I said finally, my voice cracking. If you don't want to be here, then leave. Her eyes widened slightly, but she quickly masked it with a smirk. You're kicking me out? I'm telling you to leave, I said firmly. I deserve better than this. Better than you. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the room. As the door slammed shut behind her, the weight of what had just happened settled over me. My marriage was over, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if that was a bad thing. Jessica didn't leave immediately. She stayed in the house for a few days, as though testing how much of her presence I could tolerate. The tension between us was suffocating. Every room felt smaller with her in it, every shared glance a silent war. I had hoped that confronting her would shake something loose, remorse, guilt, maybe even a spark of the person she used to be. But if anything, Jessica seemed more defiant, more indifferent to the destruction she'd caused. She didn't apologize. Not once. Instead, she acted as though I was the one overreacting, as though my anger and heartbreak were inconveniences disrupting her routine. On the third day after our confrontation, we had a fight that became the final nail in the coffin. I was in the living room, sorting through paperwork, when Jessica strolled in, phone in hand. She barely acknowledged me as she sat on the arm of the couch, scrolling and texting as if nothing had happened. "Are you seriously just going to sit there and pretend everything's fine?" I asked, my voice cutting through the silence. She looked up, her expression blank. "What do you want me to say, Alex? How about the truth?" I shot back. "How about telling me why you think it's okay to destroy our marriage and act like it's no big deal?" She sighed, setting her phone down. "We've been over this. Things weren't working. You knew that." "No," I said, standing up. "What I knew was that you were distant, that you were shutting me out. But I thought we could fix it. I thought you cared enough to at least try." Her eyes narrowed. "Don't put this all on me. You weren't exactly the perfect husband, Alex." That stopped me in my tracks. "What are you even talking about?" She shrugged, her tone casual and dismissive. "You've been so focused on work, on whatever it is you think is important. When was the last time you actually paid attention to me? Made me feel like I mattered?" I stared at her, disbelief and anger swirling inside me. "So, this is my fault now? You're blaming me for your affair?" "I'm saying it's not as black and white as you think," she said, crossing her arms. "Maybe if you had been more present, I wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere." The sheer audacity of her words left me momentarily speechless. I had spent years trying to hold us together, bending over backward to make her happy, and this was how she justified her betrayal? "You're unbelievable," I said finally, my voice trembling with rage. "I worked my ass off to give us a good life, to make sure we had everything we needed. And instead of appreciating that, you decided to throw it all away because you weren't getting enough attention?" Her eyes flashed with anger. "Don't act like you're some saint, Alex. You're not perfect. Our marriage wasn't perfect." "I never said it was," I shot back. "But I didn't give up on us. I didn't go behind your back and lie to your face. That was all you, Jessica." She stood abruptly, her posture rigid. "Fine. If you think I'm such a terrible person, maybe I should leave." "Maybe you should," I said, my voice cold. "Because I can't do this anymore. I can't keep living with someone who doesn't respect me, who doesn't value what we had." For a moment, she just stood there, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then she turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The sound of her departure echoed through the house, leaving an almost deafening silence in its wake. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. My mind replayed every argument, every red flag I had ignored, every moment I had convinced myself that things would get better. They never did. Jessica didn't come back to the bedroom that night. I heard her moving around in the guest room, her footsteps loud and deliberate, as if she wanted to remind me of her presence. The next morning, she came downstairs with a suitcase in hand. She didn't say much, just a curt, "I'll stay at a friend's for now." I didn't stop her. As the front door closed behind her, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, relief. I had spent so long trying to hold onto a marriage that no longer existed, trying to fix something that Jessica clearly didn't care about saving. And now it was over. The weight of that realization hit me like a freight train. I sat on the edge of the couch, my head in my hands, as the enormity of what had just happened washed over me. Jessica was gone, and for the first time in years, I was alone. But as painful as it was, there was a small, quiet voice in the back of my mind whispering something I hadn't allowed myself to feel until now. Maybe this is for the best. After Jessica left, the silence in the house became unbearable. It wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was heavy, suffocating, filled with the echoes of arguments and the weight of everything that had gone wrong. I tried to keep busy, throwing myself into mundane tasks like reorganizing drawers or cleaning out the garage, but no amount of chores could distract me from the hollow ache in my chest. On the third day of living alone, I finally reached out to the one person I knew would understand: Chris, my best friend since college. If there was anyone who could help me make sense of the mess my life had become, it was him. Chris showed up that evening with a six-pack of beer and a takeout bag of greasy burgers. He didn't even wait for me to invite him in. He just walked through the door like he owned the place and plopped down on the couch. "All right," he said, cracking open a beer and handing it to me. "Tell me everything." I sat across from him, the words tumbling out faster than I could organize them. I told him about Jessica's late-night outing, the suspicious phone records, the confrontation, and her eventual departure. By the time I finished, Chris's usually easygoing demeanor had hardened into something more serious. "Man," he said, leaning back and shaking his head. "I knew she was acting weird the last few times I saw her, but I didn't think this." "Yeah, well, neither did I muttered, taking a long swig of beer. Chris studied me for a moment, his expression softening. "How are you holding up?" I shrugged. "I don't know. Angry, mostly, and hurt. It's like I spent years trying to make this marriage work, and she didn't even care enough to try." "She's the one who screwed up, Alex," Chris said firmly. "Don't let her make you think this is your fault." I nodded, but the guilt still lingered. I keep replaying everything in my head, wondering if there was something I missed, something I could have done differently. "Stop," Chris said, cutting me off. "You can't fix someone who doesn't want to be fixed. Jessica made her choices, and they have nothing to do with you." His words should have been comforting, but they only highlighted the emptiness I felt. "So what now?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Chris leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Now you take a breath. You don't have to figure everything out right this second. Let yourself feel whatever you're feeling, and when you're ready, we'll take it one step at a time." I wanted to believe him, to think that there was some kind of roadmap for moving on, but all I could see was the gaping hole where my marriage used to be. After Chris left that night, I sat in the living room, staring at the blank TV screen. His words echoed in my mind. "You can't fix someone who doesn't want to be fixed." He was right, of course. I had spent years trying to hold together something that Jessica had already let go of. And now, for the first time, I was forced to confront the reality of what that meant. The next morning, I made a decision. If Jessica didn't care enough to fight for our marriage, then I wasn't going to waste any more time fighting for her. I called a lawyer. "Hi," I said when the receptionist answered. "I'd like to schedule a consultation about filing for divorce." The words felt strange on my tongue, like they didn't belong to me. But as soon as I said them, I felt a small sense of relief. The lawyer, Marcus, was professional and calm, walking me through the basics of what to expect. It was a lot to take in: assets, accounts, paperwork, but he reassured me that we'd handle it one step at a time. "Take a few days to think about it," Marcus said at the end of our call. "This is a big decision, and you want to be absolutely sure before moving forward." But I didn't need a few days. I was sure. Later that afternoon, Chris stopped by again. When I told him about the lawyer, he didn't look surprised. "I figured you'd get there eventually," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "You deserve better, Alex. You know that, right?" "Yeah," I said, though the conviction in my voice wasn't quite there yet. Chris grinned. "Good. Now let's figure out what's next." What was next? I didn't know. The future felt like a blank page, and for the first time in years, I had no idea what to write. That night, as I lay in bed, the silence didn't feel as oppressive as it had before. It was still heavy, still unfamiliar, but there was a faint undercurrent of something else, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The first step toward moving on was packing up Jessica's things. I didn't want her lingering presence to haunt the house. Every time I walked into the bedroom, her clothes in the closet, her perfume on the dresser, it felt like she was still here, like her betrayal was woven into the fabric of the place I used to call home. Chris offered to help, but I declined. This was something I needed to do alone, a necessary ritual to reclaim my space. I started with her wardrobe, pulling down dresses, tops, and shoes and tossing them into boxes with as much care as I could muster, which wasn't much. It wasn't until I reached her desk in the spare room that I found the first crack in the facade I'd been holding together. Jessica's laptop sat there, closed but not locked away. It seemed innocuous enough, but as I stared at it, something stirred inside me. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the keyboard. Part of me knew that opening it was a bad idea. I had already decided to move on. What good would it do to dig through her digital life? But the other part of me, the part that still couldn't make sense of how she'd thrown away our marriage, needed answers. I opened the laptop and immediately clicked into her email. At first, it was the usual: receipts for online shopping, work emails, subscription notifications. But then I found a folder buried in her inbox, marked simply personal. The first email I opened felt like a dagger to the chest. From Ryan. I can't wait for us to finally be together. These next few weeks will be hard, but it'll be worth it in the end. I promise. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. The timestamp on the email was from 2 months ago. Long before I'd confronted her, long before she'd walked out the door. The next email was worse. From Jessica. I keep thinking about the life we could have, just the two of us. Alex doesn't make me happy anymore. You're the only thing that feels real. The words blurred as my eyes filled with tears. She wasn't just having an affair. She was planning a future with him. While I was sitting at home, desperately trying to fix our marriage, she was fantasizing about leaving me behind entirely. I kept reading, each email another blow to the fragile sense of stability I had managed to piece together. They talked about vacations they wanted to take, places they would live, even mundane things like what kind of coffee maker Ryan preferred. It wasn't just an affair. It was a whole other life. A life she was building behind my back. And then I found the photos. They were tucked away in a separate folder, but they were there. Pictures of Jessica and Ryan together, smiling, laughing, kissing. Some of them were selfies, taken in places I didn't recognize. Others were more intimate, too much for me to stomach. I slammed the laptop shut, my chest heaving with a mix of anger and heartbreak. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a moment of weakness. Jessica had made a choice, a deliberate, calculated choice to betray me in the worst way possible. I sat there for a long time, staring at the closed laptop. I had thought I was ready to move on, but this changed everything. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about the lies, the deception, the sheer audacity of pretending that I was the problem while she was busy building a new life with someone else. That night, I called Chris. "You were right," I said as soon as he picked up. "She's worse than I thought." "What happened?" he asked, concern lacing his voice. I told him everything, the emails, the photos, the plans she'd been making with Ryan. By the time I finished, I was shaking, my voice barely steady. Chris let out a low whistle. "Jesus, Alex. That's next level messed up." "Yeah," I said, my throat tight. "I don't even know how to process it." "You don't have to," he said firmly. "Not right now. Just take it one step at a time. Get rid of her stuff, talk to your lawyer, and keep moving forward. Don't let her pull you back into her mess." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "You're right. I can't let this break me." "Damn straight," Chris said. "You're stronger than this, Alex. And she doesn't deserve another second of your energy." After we hung up, I finished packing the rest of Jessica's belongings. I boxed up her clothes, her books, her photos, everything that tied her to this house, to my life. By the time I was done, the place felt emptier, but also lighter. I left the laptop on top of the last box, a bitter reminder of everything I'd discovered. Jessica had betrayed me in ways I never thought possible. But as painful as it was, it also brought a strange sense of clarity. I wasn't the problem. She was. And I wouldn't let her lies define me. The day I walked into Marcus's office to officially begin the divorce proceedings, I felt a strange mix of dread and determination. The weight of what I was about to do wasn't lost on me. This wasn't just signing a piece of paper. It was untangling a life I'd spent years building with someone I thought I'd grow old with. Marcus greeted me with a firm handshake and a reassuring smile. His office was minimalistic, decorated with shelves of books and a single plant by the window. "You're making the right decision, Alex," he said, motioning for me to sit. I nodded, though I didn't feel confident. "Let's get started." We went through the logistics, splitting assets, the house, financial disclosures. Every word felt clinical, cold. I answered Marcus's questions automatically, but my mind wandered to the memories tied to every object we discussed. The house where Jessica and I used to laugh together. The furniture we picked out after our wedding. Even the car she drove away and had once been a symbol of our shared goals. Are you okay? Marcus asked, pulling me back to the present. Yeah, I lied. Let's just keep going. The process was grueling. Marcus explained that while divorces can be straightforward, Jessica's betrayal added a layer of complexity, particularly if she decided to contest any of the terms. Do you think she'll fight this? I asked, dreading the answer. Marcus shrugged. It's hard to say. Based on what you've told me, she's likely to try some form of manipulation, whether emotional or financial. But don't worry. We'll prepare for that. His words should have reassured me, but they only deepened the knot in my stomach. Jessica had already proven she wasn't above deceit. The idea of her dragging this out, of her trying to twist the situation to her advantage, filled me with a mix of anger and exhaustion. By the time I left Marcus's office, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the city. I sat in my car for a while, staring out at the horizon, trying to process everything. The paperwork was just the beginning, the first step in what promised to be a long and painful journey. When I got home, the house felt emptier than usual. Jessica's boxes sat near the door, ready for her to pick up. I glanced at them briefly, then turned away. I couldn't let her belongings hold power over me. That evening, I decided to start reclaiming my space. I began with the bedroom, stripping the bed of the sheets she had picked out and replacing them with a simple set I'd bought that afternoon. I removed her perfume bottles from the dresser, her books from the nightstand. Each small act felt like taking a step forward, no matter how painful it was. Then I moved to the living room, taking down the framed photos of us that had once seemed like proof of a happy marriage. I hesitated for a moment, holding one of the pictures in my hands. It was from our honeymoon, a snapshot of us smiling on a beach, arms wrapped around each other. I stared at the photo for a long time, my chest tightening. The man in that picture looked so happy, so certain of the life ahead of him. I barely recognized him now. Without overthinking it, I placed the photo in a box labeled Jessica. It didn't belong here anymore. As I worked, I found a strange sense of relief in the process. Every item I removed felt like I was taking back a piece of myself. It wasn't easy. Some items brought back memories that threatened to break me, but it was necessary. By the time I finished, the house looked different. It wasn't completely mine yet, but it was getting there. The silence didn't feel as oppressive as it had before. The next morning, I texted Marcus to let him know I was ready to file the papers. His response was quick and professional, outlining the next steps. Jessica hadn't reached out since leaving, and I wasn't sure if that was a good thing, or if she was simply waiting for the right moment to strike. Either way, I wasn't going to let her control the narrative anymore. Chris came over that evening, bringing pizza and a bottle of whiskey. As we sat on the couch, he glanced around the room, noticing the absence of Jessica's things. "You've been busy," he said, nodding toward the cleared-out spaces. "Had to," I replied, taking a sip of whiskey. "It's not much, but it's a start." He raised his glass. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings," I echoed, though my voice lacked the same conviction. As the days passed, I threw myself into work and small projects around the house. The legal process was slow but steady, each step bringing me closer to closure. There were moments when the weight of it all threatened to pull me under, when the loneliness and the anger felt too heavy to bear. But each time, I reminded myself why I was doing this. Jessica had chosen her path, and now it was my turn to choose mine. For the first time in years, I was starting to believe that I could build something new, something better. It had been weeks since Jessica left, and the silence between us had become an unspoken agreement. Her belongings were gone. The divorce process was underway, and I was slowly learning how to exist in this new version of my life. So when my phone buzzed late one evening, and her name flashed across the screen, my stomach twisted into a knot. I stared at the phone for a few seconds, debating whether to answer. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let it go to voicemail and pretend I hadn't seen it. But another part of me, the part that still craved answers, closure, reached for the phone. "Hello? Alex." Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. It wasn't the confident, indifferent tone I had grown used to. "What do you want, Jessica?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a deep sigh. I want to talk. Can we meet? My grip tightened on the phone. What is there to talk about? You made your choices, Jessica. You don't get to rewrite the story now. I know, she said quickly. I need to explain. Please. I wanted to hang up, to deny her the opportunity to twist the knife any further. But curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her the next day at a coffee shop downtown. The next morning, I arrived early, grabbing a seat near the back where I could see the door. My nerves were on edge as I watched people come and go, my mind racing with what she might say. When Jessica finally walked in, she looked different. There was no confident stride, no aura of defiance. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped and her expression subdued. She spotted me and walked over, hesitating for a moment before sitting down. Thanks for coming, she said softly, avoiding my eyes. I didn't respond. I simply leaned back in my chair, waiting for her to speak. She took a deep breath, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her jacket. I've been doing a lot of thinking, she began. About us. About everything that happened. I raised an eyebrow. And her eyes finally met mine, and I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time, guilt. I screwed up, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. I made mistakes I can't take back, and I hurt you in ways I never should have. Her words hung in the air, but they didn't bring the relief I thought they might. They felt hollow, too little, too late. Why now, Jessica? I asked, my voice steady. Why are you telling me this now? She looked down at the table, her hands clasped tightly. Because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. You didn't deserve what I did to you, Alex. And I need you to know that I'm sorry. Sorry? I repeated, my tone sharp. You're sorry? Do you think that fixes anything? Do you think that erases the lies, the betrayal, the months I spent trying to save a marriage you had already walked away from? She flinched at my words, her shoulders sagging even further. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said quietly. I needed you to know. I studied her for a moment, searching for sincerity. Maybe she meant it. Maybe she really was sorry. But her apology didn't change anything. It didn't undo the pain, the nights I spent questioning my worth, the humiliation of discovering just how little I meant to her. What do you want from me, Jessica? I asked, my voice calm but firm. Closure? Redemption? Because whatever it is, I can't give it to you. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly. I just wanted to apologize. That's all. I nodded slowly, leaning forward. I accept your apology, but that doesn't mean anything changes. We're done, Jessica. We've been done for a long time. She nodded, wiping at her eyes. I understand. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something real in her, a vulnerability she had always been so good at hiding. But it didn't stir anything in me. The part of me that once loved her was gone, buried beneath layers of hurt and betrayal. As she stood to leave, she hesitated, looking at me one last time. I hope you find someone who makes you happy, Alex, she said softly. Take care, Jessica, I replied, my tone even. She walked out of the coffee shop, and I didn't watch her go. Instead, I stared at the empty chair across from me, the weight of the conversation settling over me. Her apology might have been genuine, but it didn't matter. It wasn't closure I needed, it was distance. And now, for the first time, I felt like I could finally start to move forward. The coffee shop conversation marked the last significant interaction I had with Jessica. Her apology had come too late, like a Band-Aid slapped on a wound that had already scarred over. As I walked back to my car that day, I felt an odd sense of finality. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was something close. The next few weeks passed quietly. The divorce process moved forward, each step nudging me closer to freedom. Marcus handled most of the heavy lifting, ensuring things were fair and efficient. Jessica, to my surprise, didn't contest anything. Perhaps she knew there was nothing left to fight for, or maybe she just wanted to move on as much as I did. I focused on reclaiming my life in small, deliberate ways. I rearranged the furniture in the living room, painted the walls a different color, and hung up new artwork that felt like me. I replaced the dishes and utensils we'd picked out together with a simple set I bought on a whim. It was cathartic, like peeling away layers of a life that no longer fit. Chris was a constant presence during this time, checking in on me and dragging me out of the house whenever he thought I was spending too much time alone. We went to bars, caught a few games, and even signed up for a Saturday morning hiking group. "You're doing good, man," Chris said one evening as we sat on his patio, beers in hand. "Better than I thought you would, honestly." I chuckled. "Thanks for the vote of confidence." He grinned. "I'm serious. I know this has been hell, but you've handled it better than most people would." I nodded, taking a sip of my beer. I guess I didn't have much of a choice. It was either let it destroy me or figure out how to move on. "Still," Chris said, raising his bottle in a mock toast, "here's to moving on." "Here's to moving on," I echoed, clinking my bottle against his. As the divorce finalized, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. The paperwork officially marked the end of a chapter one had once believed would last forever. But it also felt like a beginning, an opportunity to redefine who I was and what I wanted. One of the biggest changes was learning how to be alone. After years of sharing my life with someone, the silence of an empty house was both comforting and unnerving. I filled the gaps with music, audiobooks, and long walks around the neighborhood. I started journaling, something I hadn't done since college, pouring my thoughts onto the page as a way to process everything. There were moments when the loneliness crept in, threatening to pull me back into the spiral of what-ifs and whys. But each time, I reminded myself of the truth. I deserved better than what Jessica had given me. One day, while cleaning out a forgotten drawer in the guest room, I found an old photo album. It was filled with pictures from the early days of my marriage. Weekend trips, holidays, quiet moments captured in smiles and laughter. For a moment, I considered tossing it in the trash, erasing the memories along with everything else. But I didn't. Instead, I closed the album and tucked it away in the back of the closet. Those memories, as painful as they were still a part of my story. They didn't define me, but they shaped me, and I wasn't ready to let go of them entirely. Slowly but surely, I began to find peace in the quiet. I rediscovered hobbies I'd abandoned, like photography and woodworking. I spent weekends exploring new places, sometimes with Chris, sometimes alone. The biggest shift came when I realized I was no longer consumed by thoughts of Jessica. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal, they were still there, but they no longer controlled me. They had become background noise, a dull hum in the distance instead of the overwhelming roar they once were. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope for the future, for the possibilities that lay ahead. Chris had been right. The end of my marriage wasn't the end of my story. It was just a turning point, a chance to start fresh. For the first time in years, I felt ready to embrace whatever came next. Months passed, and life began to take on a rhythm I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't chaotic or loud. It was steady, peaceful even. I wasn't waking up every morning dreading the day, nor was I consumed by thoughts of Jessica. The divorce was final. Her shadow no longer lingered in my home, and the silence that had once felt suffocating now felt freeing. Chris had been relentless about pushing me to re-enter the social world. "You can't sit on the sidelines forever," he said one evening over a beer. "Get out there. Meet people. You're too young to give up on life." At first, I resisted. The idea of dating again felt like a far-off, foreign concept. How could I even think about starting over with someone new after everything I'd been through? But Chris wouldn't let up. One Saturday, he dragged me to a casual outdoor event, a food truck festival downtown. That's where I met Rachel. She wasn't flashy or over the top. She wasn't trying to command attention like Jessica always had. She was standing in line for tacos, chatting with the vendor about the best way to cook pork belly, her laugh infectious and genuine. Something about her felt different, authentic in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Chris noticed me watching and nudged my arm. "Go talk to her." I shook my head. "I'm not ready." "You're ready enough. Just say hi." After some grumbling, I walked over, and somehow, hi turned into a 15-minute conversation about food, travel, and a shared love for classic rock. She was kind and charismatic, with a sharp wit that kept me on my toes. We exchanged numbers that day. For the first time in years, I felt a spark. One that didn't come with strings, expectations, or complications. It was light, easy, and real. Rachel and I didn't rush into anything, which was exactly what I needed. We started with small, simple moments, a coffee here, a casual dinner there. There were no grand declarations, no pressure to define what we were. It was refreshing to be around someone who didn't expect me to fill some predefined role. With Rachel, I could just be. She had this way of making everything feel lighter, like the world wasn't as heavy as I'd thought. Our conversations ranged from the trivial to the deeply personal, and she never flinched when I talked about my divorce. She listened without judgment, without pity. "You've been through a lot," she said one evening as we sat on a park bench, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "But you're still here. That says something about you." Her words stuck with me. For so long, I had defined myself by what I'd lost. My marriage, my sense of stability, the future I thought I was building. But Rachel made me see that those losses didn't diminish me. They shaped me, made me stronger, and, in some ways, made me more open to the possibilities ahead. Chris noticed the change almost immediately. "You're different," he said one night over beers. "Happier, more alive." I shrugged, a small smile tugging at my lips. "It's Rachel. She's different." "Good different." "Yeah," I said, nodding. "Good different." For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't just surviving, I was living. Rachel didn't just help me heal. She reminded me that life wasn't over, that there were still moments of joy to be found, still connections to be made. She didn't fix me. No one could do that but me. But she showed me that there was life after heartbreak. Moving forward wasn't a straight path. There were days when the weight of the past crept in, when I wondered if I deserved the happiness I was beginning to feel. But each time, I reminded myself of how far I'd come. This wasn't the ending I had imagined for my life, but it was a new beginning. And for the first time, I was ready to embrace it.